A tax compliance officer sits in front of 3 monitors while a scrolling ledger reorganizes itself in real time, and the interface highlights accounts not by size, but by how completely their ownership trails are documented. Across the room, nothing appears dramatic, yet the software quietly ranks targets by how little resistance a seizure would encounter, which shifts attention away from wealth and toward visibility. That quiet sorting process resembles a broader structural condition, now shaping enforcement priorities, because modern asset systems increasingly reward institutions that can act where information is already centralized. During the expansion of U.S. civil asset forfeiture after the 1984 Comprehensive Crime Control Act, legal authority widened faster than public awareness, and agencies learned to value procedural speed as much as evidentiary certainty. The mechanism underneath is administrative friction. When ownership records are standardized and custody sits with intermediaries, intervention becomes operationally simple. Although that simplicity depends on the continued cooperation of those intermediaries. A present parallel appears in the automation of brokerage reporting and payroll platforms, where compliance pipelines transmit structured data directly to regulators. Yet these channels still rely on accurate classification by private custodians. What looks like a neutral upgrade in record-keeping, therefore, doubles as a map of accessible pressure points, even if the system cannot reach assets that sit outside those mapped corridors. This environment invites a particular kind of search behavior, because enforcement bodies tend to operate where observation is easiest rather than where theoretical value is highest. Psychologists describe a related bias as the streetlight effect, and the analogy translates cleanly into fiscal administration. Attention concentrates under illuminated zones of data density. Such concentration produces efficiency gains by reducing investigative cost. Although it risks overlooking complex holdings that resist straightforward categorization, in practice, the illuminated zone corresponds to assets held inside custodial platforms that already reconcile identity, transaction history, and reporting obligations. During the early rollout of electronic funds transfer reporting in the late 20th century, agencies discovered that digitized trails shortened enforcement cycles, yet analog instruments persisted precisely because they generated informational shadows. The operational mechanism is not surveillance alone, but the coupling of surveillance with custody, since a custodian can execute instructions that an observer alone cannot. Contemporary fintech ecosystems intensify that coupling by embedding compliance hooks directly into account architecture, while decentralized or privately held assets remain partially insulated by design limits. Even so, insulation is never absolute, because interfaces between formal and informal systems create conversion points that reintroduce visibility. Once custody and observation converge, prioritization begins to follow a logic closer to queue management than to moral judgment. Enforcement units allocate finite personnel toward cases, promising rapid procedural closure. And the 1984 forfeiture framework institutionalized that calculus by channeling recovered assets back into agency budgets. An incentive loop emerges in which easily executable seizures replenish the very resources required to pursue future actions, though statutory oversight constrains how aggressively that loop can operate. Modern analytics platforms replicate the same preference by flagging accounts whose documentation minimizes legal ambiguity. Yet, algorithmic scoring can misclassify edge cases that still demand human review. The result is a hierarchy of targets ordered by administrative accessibility, which subtly decouples enforcement sequencing from headline asset values. Understanding that hierarchy requires examining how intermediaries translate legal authority into mechanical action. Broker-dealers and payment processors maintain internal compliance teams that preemptively align their systems with regulatory expectations, and historical precedents show that institutions surviving enforcement waves tend to cooperate early rather than contest late. The Soviet banking reforms of the early 1990s illustrated this dynamic, when newly privatized entities adopted Western reporting standards to secure legitimacy, although informal cash networks continued operating beyond formal oversight. Mechanically, an intermediary serves as an execution lever, once presented with valid authority. It can freeze or transfer holdings without physically accessing the asset itself. Current cloud-based financial infrastructure amplifies that lever by centralizing operational control panels. while jurisdictional fragmentation still complicates cross-border execution. Consequently, the asset most exposed to early action is the one resting at the narrowest custodial choke point. Even if alternative stores of value exist outside that channel, that observation invites a broader methodological stance, sometimes summarized as financial forensics, studying past system failures to understand what survives. Custodial choke points rarely appear accidental because financial architecture tends to compress control into nodes that can be audited and instructed with minimal delay. When British authorities expanded exchange controls in 1939, commercial banks became enforcement gateways overnight. Yet private hoarding of foreign notes persisted in informal circuits that banks could not fully penetrate. The mechanism at work is architectural asymmetry. Systems optimize for manageability by concentrating authority, although that concentration simultaneously advertises where intervention will be most efficient. A modern parallel surfaces in centralized digital wallets linked to tax identity numbers, where transaction reversibility increases administrative leverage. While peer-to-peer transfers still introduce pockets of procedural friction, from an enforcement perspective, the first asset approached is not the most controversial, but the one whose custody already implies consent to standardized rules. Legal frameworks reinforce that preference by embedding compliance obligations into licensing regimes, and the post-1984 forfeiture environment encouraged agencies to test those obligations through routine execution. Operationally, this creates a feedback cycle in which repeated law resistance actions normalize the presence of seizure as an administrative tool. Though appellate courts occasionally redraw boundaries after contested cases, recent disputes over account freezes on digital trading platforms illustrate how quickly custodians can act under regulatory guidance. Yet those actions remain tethered to due process timelines that vary by jurisdiction. Visibility alone does not guarantee priority unless it pairs with procedural clarity about ownership. Land registries in several post-Soviet states during the 1990s demonstrated that incomplete title records stalled state claims, and authorities often deferred action until documentation stabilized. The underlying mechanism is evidentiary compression, when ownership chains collapse into a single verified record. Execution requires fewer interpretive steps. Although complex trusts and layered entities deliberately expand those steps, contemporary beneficial ownership databases aim to compress that chain again by linking natural persons to legal vehicles. While enforcement still depends on the accuracy of submitted disclosures, priority, therefore, gravitates toward assets whose ownership narratives have already been simplified for regulatory consumption. Administrative systems also prefer environments where reversibility is technically built into the asset itself. During the early adoption of automated clearinghouses in the United States, payment reversals became procedurally standardized, which encouraged regulators to treat electronic balances as dynamically adjustable entries. This reversibility functions as a mechanical permission structure that lowers the operational cost of intervention. Even though final settlement layers, such as cash withdrawals, reintroduce irreversibility, today's integrated banking APIs extend that adjustable quality by synchronizing records across institutions. Yet legacy systems still impose timing gaps that complicate instantaneous action. An asset residing inside a reversible ledger invites earlier attention than one requiring physical recovery. Despite these structural tendencies, enforcement sequencing encounters practical ceilings that resist full optimization. Resource constraints, political scrutiny, and judicial oversight collectively moderate how aggressively agencies pursue the most visible targets. And historical forfeiture surges often receded after public challenges. The same moderating forces operate in contemporary settings where transparency requirements expose enforcement patterns to external review. Although internal prioritization algorithms remain largely opaque, this tension between operational efficiency and institutional restraint leaves the hierarchy of targets fluid rather than fixed. What consistently fails first under pressure is the assumption that value alone determines vulnerability. Historical currency reforms from Latin America to Eastern Europe reveal that assets embedded in formal custodial networks experienced rapid administrative adjustment, while informal stores retained temporary autonomy. The mechanism is structural exposure, Integration into official channels increases both protection and susceptibility. Even if informal alternatives carry their own risks of instability, current global signals show accelerating consolidation of financial data infrastructures, alongside experiments in decentralized custody, yet neither trajectory eliminates the trade-off between visibility and control. Any attempt to rank asset safety without accounting for custodial architecture therefore misreads the system's operating logic. Under present conditions, the interaction between visibility and custody forms a moving boundary rather than a fixed rule. Regulatory systems continuously recalibrate their reach as financial products evolve, and the late 20th century expansion of derivative clearinghouses showed how new instruments are often pulled into centralized oversight once their scale becomes systemic. The mechanism here is adaptive enclosure. Authorities extend familiar control frameworks toward emerging assets. Although innovation routinely outruns the speed of formal integration, recent debates around centralized crypto exchanges demonstrate that platforms seeking legitimacy adopt reporting structures resembling traditional brokerages. While self-custodied alternatives persist outside those templates, this adaptive process does not predict a single outcome, yet it narrows the corridor in which highly visible assets operate. Practical synthesis begins with recognizing that exposure is a spectrum shaped by architecture rather than intention. During Argentina's 2001 banking restrictions, account holders discovered that legal access to deposits depended less on nominal ownership than on how funds were institutionally parked, and informal cash economies expanded in response. The underlying mechanism is custodial translation. When assets pass through intermediaries, their usability becomes contingent on institutional stability. Even if alternative channels introduce their own fragilities, contemporary financial networks exhibit similar translation layers through payment processors and clearing agents, while cross-platform interoperability still leaves seams where authority is uneven. Understanding those seams clarifies why enforcement attention clusters without assuming uniform reach. Yet any framework built on clustering must acknowledge its own limits. Complex asset structures can deliberately diffuse custody across jurisdictions, and historical attempts to consolidate control often produced unintended migration into less regulated spaces. That diffusion mechanism reduces immediate accessibility. Although it increases operational complexity for holders who rely on fragmented systems, present global signals suggest a continued negotiation between consolidation and dispersion, with institutions seeking efficiency as users hedge against concentration. No stable equilibrium has emerged, which keeps prioritization strategies provisional. Returning to the opening scene, the officer's interface does not display wealth as a static inventory, but as a gradient of administrative approachability. Each highlighted account represents a point where custody and documentation converge sufficiently to permit action, echoing decades of legal evolution that favor frictionless execution over symbolic magnitude. Through the lens of the streetlight effect, the ranking system appears less like a hunt for the largest target and more like a navigation chart tracing illuminated corridors. Assets positioned within those corridors inherit both the protections and the exposures created by their intermediaries, a dual condition that resists simple classification. The earlier sorting process, therefore, reads as an operational snapshot of a broader system, balancing efficiency against boundary conditions. Financial structures continue to reorganize around that balance, and any interpretation remains contingent on how custody, visibility, and institutional restraint interact at a given moment.